Hello, I'm Fran Burwell, a Distinguished Fellow at the Europe Center of the Atlantic Council, and this is Atlantic Debrief, brought to you from the Europe Center. Today, in cooperation with the Council's Digital Forensics Research Lab, we welcome Doreen Bogdan-Martin, Secretary General of the International Telecommunications Union, or ITU. A pleasure to have you join us.
Thank you, Fran. Great to be here.
The ITU was founded in 1865 as the International Telegraph Union to manage what was then a key area of communications. It became a UN specialized agency in 1947. It must have been one of the very first, because that was just after the UN itself was founded. You were elected last year in September 2022, and you are the first woman in the post, as I understand it. And you took office at the beginning of 2023. Prior to being elected, Bogdan-Martin had worked in the ITU in a number of positions, including as head of the Development Bureau, as executive director of the ITU's Commission on Sustainable Development, and as the head of strategic planning. Before joining the ITU in 2008, she worked at the Commerce Department's National Telecommunications and Information Administration. Your election caused quite a bit of stir and was a priority for the US government. For those who may not know the International Telecommunications Union, can you tell us about the role of the ITU and why it is so important, why it matters?
Thank you. Sometimes referred to as the most important agency that nobody's ever heard of. I like to think it is the most important agency that we've all heard of. So the ITU, as you said, has been around since 1865, oldest in the UN system. It dates back to the creation of the telegraph, and the fundamental reason for its creation was to be able to pass telegraphic messages from one country to another. Of course, we've evolved over time from telegraph to telephone to television, and of course now the internet, and looking to the future, emerging in new technologies. And basically our key functions are linked to spectrum, so managing the finite resources around radio communications spectrum for services. Of course, standards, helping to develop voluntary, interoperable technical standards. And then the third piece is linked to development. And as you mentioned, that's the part that I previously led, and that's focused on connecting the unconnected. And we have 2.7 billion people that have never, ever been connected. Still, yes.
So what are your priorities now as Secretary General? And if I can also just get you to expand a little bit more on the role of these communications in our everyday lives. Because I think when you say radio spectrum and standards, I suspect that a lot of people really don't understand how important those are.
Yeah, well, it's what makes it work. And of course, we take it for granted because we're connected, but as a third of humanity is not connected, we have to make sure that we can connect those unconnected. I think that the pandemic put connectivity and digital issues at the top of every agenda, including, of course, here in the United States, but also in the UN system, because we saw what happened if you didn't have access to connectivity when everyone was quarantined and the world essentially moved online overnight. But coming to my priorities and the priorities of the ITU, it's very much linked to universal connectivity, so ensuring that everybody's connected by 2030. And it's also about sustainable digital transformation. And as we look at digital issues, which are essentially cross-cutting across every sector of the economy, we want to make sure that they're also sustainable. And the climate issues, of course, are also growing in importance.
But when you look at the way technology is evolving now, when I look at this, it's not only there's a very basic issue which you've talked about, which is the digital divide or the lack of connectivity. I know that both in Europe and here, there are big efforts to increase broadband, but in many areas of the world, as you point out, it's a much, much, much bigger challenge. What can the ITU do specifically on that? How can you help countries increase that? And then if you could also speak, we have a lot of new technologies. Mm-hmm. And maybe you could speak to some of those and what the ITU's role is in those. Yeah. But first, what specifically can you do to help the countries that are really struggling to get connectivity?
Yeah, of course, I would say those struggling the most, of course, are the least developed countries, where connectivity numbers range from less than 10% connected to maybe 30% connected, so there's much to do. When we look at infrastructure, I think the encouraging thing is mobile network coverage covers most of the planet.
Okay.
So it's not necessarily a coverage issue, it's more, well, getting to the last mile, getting to the hardest to connect, but it's also issues linked to stimulating demand. It's issues linked to the cost of devices, the cost of services. It's about digital skills, making sure that when people get connected, that they can actually use the connectivity, making sure that the connectivity brings services that are relevant to local communities and local languages that can be used to help empower and enable.
Right.
So there's many things we can do, from the policy regulatory support to the infrastructure support, cybersecurity support as well, as many people choose not to get online because of cyber-related issues. And that's where ITU tries to leverage the expertise of our three sectors, development, radio, and standards, to tackle that.
So there are you mentioned cybersecurity, and there are a lot of new emerging technologies, or at least it feels like it all the time. So we're in the middle of most places setting up their 5G, but already thinking about 6G. AI has been a huge priority and a huge attention getter over the last couple of months. To what degree in those three areas, and others that you may wish, other new technologies that are coming on board, quantum computing, et cetera, how do they relate to the ITU? What is your role in terms of addressing those?
So when it comes to 5G and ultimately 6G related issues, again, we keep in mind that there are some that still have 2G and 3G. So we're trying to sort of balance things and focus on bringing those that are least connected, more connected. Again, 5G, 6G issues have to do with our work on standards, also have to do with our work linked to spectrum. We have an upcoming World Radio Communications Conference in November, where we'll look at a number of spectrum-related issues and also the next steps in terms of our studies linked to 6G. On the AI front, which makes headlines every day, we've just concluded our 6th edition of our AI for Good Summit.
Okay.
The summit is very much focused on the good pieces of AI and how AI can help us achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Okay. But of course, this year's summit had a huge focus on generative AI, and I think rightly so. So looking for ways that together, as a multi-stakeholder group, we can talk about guardrails, safeguards, and the need for some kind of regulatory approach to mitigate the risk while not stifling innovation. We have a number of UN groups that we're active in. ITU co-leads a UN interagency group with 40 different agencies, and we're trying to put our heads together to advance, to support countries, and in particular developing countries, when it comes to emerging AI issues.
So there are places like the EU that are developing their own rules on AI. And last week we had some guidelines issued by the White House, big meeting with the heads of many of the companies. Right. How does the ITU's efforts relate to those in terms of this kind of bridge between different national regulatory frameworks that are emerging versus what we do together in the global communications commons?
So at our summit, we were fortunate to have the EU representatives with us talking about the EU AI Act, and we also had White House representatives talking about the blueprint from last May, and of course we followed the commitments announced last week. I think what's important here, and this is where the ITU and the UN system as a whole can add value,
right,
and that's in our convening ability, so bringing together policymakers, bringing together regulators, in particular from the Global South, bringing the private sector, academia, leading scientists together to talk about who's doing what and what can we learn from each other. You know, I think there are different approaches being tried and tested, and this is a moment where we need to come together and try to figure out how we carve the path forward. The UN system and the UN Secretary General has been speaking about the need for a new agency, potentially, an AI council. Right. We've heard calls for an AI observatory, but I think it's pretty clear that we can't just sit back and watch it all happen. We need to be proactive.
So you mentioned multilateral stakeholders. And you were elected by the member states. There are like 190 of them, 193?
93, yeah.
But clearly this is an area where a lot of companies are involved. And there are also other stakeholders. Can you say something about how you interact? What is multilateral stakeholder governance as far as the ITU is concerned? How does that work?
Yeah, so we call it multi-stakeholderism.
Okay.
It's a term that some don't like, but I think it's an important concept, and I think the ITU uniquely embraces and embodies that concept because while we're 193 governments, as you mentioned, we also have more than 900 private sector companies and academic institutions and civil society members that are part of the ITU family. And while that constituent group can't necessarily vote for the elected officials, they can contribute to and participate in the policy-making discussions, in the standards-making discussions, and of course in the discussions linked to the radio conference. And so I think that ability to convene those different constituent groups gives the ITU significant relevance and makes it a great platform to share experiences.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Secretary General. It's wonderful to hear about the ITU, what it is, what it does, your priorities. And we look forward to further discussions, and we'll be watching the ITU as we move forward through these new technologies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.